currently interested in the intersection of feminist theory and urban geographies.
Yeah, I am a feminist. Gosh, what a humongous question. You see, if I'd known you were going to ask me this, I would have prepped an essay. This is a supervision, David. Well, again, you sound like a critical geographer, David.
Space.
Do I? If I were Queen of the World.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's such a massive question. And if I pause to think about it, it's going to be really boring for the listeners because I'd be silent for like 5 minutes, just thinking things through.
The Queen of the World.
I would just think, oh my God, she was so stupid. She was so stupid. That was when the Everybody's Invited stuff happened. I don't know if you know what that was. From people detailing their experiences with sexual harassment. And it really exposed the underbelly of some of these very well-known, very prestigious schools in England. And Westminster was one of the schools that was on the top of that list. Saying, this boy who I knew, who was from Westminster, did this to me. And I was there for both of these big, sort of massive disruptions to the school culture.
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. I'm joined today in week 7 of Lent term at Cambridge by an extraordinarily quirky guest in a good way, of course. And instead of enjoying a coffee, we've decided to get ice cream due to time constraints. We are approaching 10,000 podcast downloads, and if you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, thank you, and please do consider nominating a guest and leaving a review by contacting me via my Linktree, David Quan. For those new to the podcast, welcome and thank you for your engagement. Please know that I don't take your time and feedback for granted, because when I started this podcast at a low point of my time in Cambridge, I was mostly nervous about humiliating myself. But I went ahead with this passion project based on 3 ideals which still make up the content descriptions for each podcast episode. First, a purpose of giving. Second, learning from others. And third, sharing of stories. I'll be the first to admit my many inadequacies, and I'll certainly listen back to laugh at how naive I am. But I genuinely maintain this deep conviction that the passion project, if wholly true to the founding motivations about giving, learning and sharing, is a worthwhile pursuit. Seeing this podcast on people's Spotify Wraps or receiving positive messages about the guests always put a big smile on my face. I cannot thank all the guests enough for their courage and insights. For now, I'm excited to host my guest, Jo Fang, or she sometimes likes to be referred to as Jo Fang, very quickly in one word. Jo is a second-year geography undergraduate at St Catherine's College, University of Cambridge. Born and raised in London as the daughter of Cantonese immigrants, she has grown up between 2 cultures. After graduating, she plans to pursue further studies and hopes to go into research. She's particularly interested in the intersection of feminist theory and urban geographies. In her free time, she enjoys, in no particular order, efficient nap-taking, playing in jazz bands, eating rice, learning languages, and admiring her personal rock collection, and is always up for a discussion on anything, including, but not limited to, the entire discography of One Direction. Jo, what a fascinating bio. Welcome to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
How's the ice cream?
Oh, it's fantastic. I definitely chose the right flavour.
What flavour?
Mango's my favourite fruit.
That's brilliant. So, Jo, not to embarrass you, but you topped the Tripos at Cambridge. That is an extraordinary achievement.
Yeah, I mean...
Number 1. Top in your cohorts.
It's still quite something which I struggle to process. I'm very glad that it happened. I doubt it will happen again. So I consider myself very lucky to be in this position. I almost find it difficult to talk about, I think. Definitely.
Hence why I'm asking you.
Hence why you're asking me about it. Yeah, it's a great start to the podcast, yeah. I think that's what actually, I mean, you said that in my introduction, I've said that I want to go into further studies, and I think that's been a real factor in it. I kind of went through first year not thinking about grades at all, and really enjoying my time. I really enjoyed my first year here. I really thought I'd picked the right degree, and then it ended up being that I did really well. I definitely think there's a lot of luck involved. I think people who topped the year group don't really like to talk about it that much because it puts them in almost like an arrogant lie, which I definitely agree with. I try not to speak about it too often, but there is definitely a lot of luck involved. So I feel like everything came together really well, you know.
Feel free to say no, but is there a Tripos Toffers group chat?
Oh, no. If there is, I'm not on it. If there is, I'm not on it. I think, yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if there is, and I'm not privy to this secret.
Let's go with this idea of a Tripos Toppers group chat.
Yeah.
What do you think would actually be discussed in there? How frequent would it be? What kind of stuff would be fed in? Would it just be like academic articles? Or...
Oh my god.
Let's just imagine what it would be like.
You'd be taking people from completely different degrees, wouldn't you? And mixing them together. So, I'd be very interested to meet the person who topped, you know, the maths tripos. I feel like they'd be a really...
I don't think you'll meet them.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting.
I love math most, but go on, Jake.
You'd have a bunch of people who are, you know, completely obsessed and really, I assume, enveloped in their particular discipline. So I'm not sure that sharing academic papers would be what's going on there. Probably because I wouldn't understand half of them, the ones that I shared. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any shared characteristic between people who end up topping tripos. I think there's always a lot of luck involved, especially in subjects where the marking is a bit more subjective. Yeah, because there's just so much luck involved. I really don't think that there would be... I don't know, what do you think? All tripos toppers, do you think there's like a framework? Like, is there like an archetype of people who top tripos? I don't think so.
Yeah, I guess it's always hard to generalise, although I guess we can be confident that, yes, luck is involved, but you need to put yourself in a position to be lucky. Like, you need to be in the game. Like, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. Like, you still need to do your super work, and you clearly love your subject and have gone above and beyond and show some kind of extraordinary sacrifice, I think. I mean, I came across this term, seems like an oxymoron, but like an insecure overachiever. And I guess... I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying I thought it really hit me because...
Yeah.
I found that at times I strive very hard for very positive reasons, like I love this or I really want to do that for other people or for service or whatever it is. But there are times when I try really hard because I'm scared of not making the most out of the opportunities I've been given, of letting people down, of, you know, potentially just failing. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on the motivations that you have of working so hard to have achieved what you have?
I think that the insecure... I think in my opinion, most overachievers would be insecure because once you start achieving, you start having expectations for yourself. And I definitely think, coming from my background as an Asian immigrant, and being raised understanding the sacrifices that my parents have made to get me here, a lot of the achievement that I strive towards has been for the sake of my parents or for the sake of giving back something in return for what they've given me. And so when I don't perform in the ways that I wanted to, I feel that I'm not only letting down myself, I'm letting down my parents. And I think that's actually an experience which is quite common to a lot of Asian immigrants. I went to 2 quite intense schools, and I was surrounded by people who were incredibly high-performing, high-flying individuals who simultaneously downplayed their achievements and were always striving for something more. And I don't think there's anything wrong in striving for something more and always looking to the next step. But I definitely grew up around a lot of people who had similar mentalities of, like, there's always something more for me to achieve, you know? And... yeah, I think it's not really an oxymoron to me, an insecure overachiever. I mean, the more you achieve, the more pressure I suppose you would feel.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I read a bit into the so-called, like, Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you heard of that. It's basically like a cognitive bias whereby, like, people with actually, like, lower ability, expertise or experience often regard like a certain task or area of knowledge is like they feel like they've grasped it and they kind of overestimate their ability. And whereas like the people who actually do really well are the ones who are like, oh, I'm not sure, oh, I'm a bit worried. And it's not because they are necessarily intentionally humble, but it's just that they recognize how much they don't know because they're able to recognize that they don't know. And it's really kind of interesting to hear what you say about like immigrant kind of that mentality and seeing, I guess, the sacrifice that your parents have made. When did they move, and were you born in the UK then?
So I was born in the UK. I want to say I was born maybe 2 or 3 years after they moved here. Okay. So my brother, who's 5 years older than me, was born in China.
Okay.
They moved over when he was about 3 or 4, and then I was born. Yeah, so I want to say it was probably a year or 2 after they got here. So I was raised here, but you know how there are different levels of integration. So you can have, I mean, I've met some people who were born and raised here, but their parents, their life at home is entirely the culture that they're from, and there's no overlap. And then I've met people who were born here, but for example, I mean, I'm not at all saying that this is a bad thing, but they don't speak their mother language, for example. And there's a real range. I think it really depends on how much your parents try to integrate you into the society that they've moved to. My parents kind of did like a 50-50. So, for example, my parents speak English pretty well. And I was raised in a very much hybrid Western Chinese way. But I have friends, for example, who were also born here, but their lives at home are far more Chinese, I would say, than my life at home was.
Why did they move?
I think the story is that they moved for the education, which makes sense. It seems like a very Chinese immigrant thing to do, definitely. They moved here because they wanted to give my brother a better education, and then I was born, and they wanted to give me a better education. They thought the system here was better. And, well, I've ended up here, so I guess they were right. Yeah.
I mean, the efficient nap-taking, that's quite a thing to learn.
It's my favourite thing to do. I take probably at least a nap a day. Half an hour. I used to do it at school. It started at school.
What, so lunchtimes?
I mean, it started when I moved to my second school for sixth form, and it was a school which was open. It was a boarding/day school, so it was open 24/7 essentially. But I would get there quite early and I'd leave quite late, and so I would always find time. Like, my favourite time to sleep was after school ended, at like 4:30, and I'd go to bed on the sofas in the common room for half an hour, and then I'd wake up and I'd be ready to go.
Wow.
And I still do it to this day. I go home and I nap, and then I go back out again.
So right after this, is that why you didn't want coffee?
No, it's usually if I'm having a really busy day, I'll take half an hour out to nap. But 20 minutes is apparently the ideal time to nap. Did you know this?
I didn't know
this.
There's
it's to do with your sleep cycle, and the most efficient amount of time to be asleep is 20 minutes. If you sleep less than that, you're not well rested enough. If you sleep more than that, you end up becoming more tired.
But does that include like the time to fall asleep? I mean, I don't fall asleep straight away. I don't know if you do.
I think maybe it's like you need to be in a
deep sleep
for 20 minutes, but that's enough. But obviously it doesn't feel like enough because it's very tempting to nap for an hour or two.
So did you make this decision to take a nap off of a research piece? I just get really
tired.
Okay.
Yeah, I just get really tired. I'm not one of those people that can survive on... I mean, I feel like you're one of these people, David. You get like 6-7 hours of sleep and you're ready to go. I'm not that girl. I wish I were. I feel like it would make my life a lot more efficient if I were. But I need at least 8.5, 9 hours, and then I'll take another nap during the day.
Okay.
Although it's really interesting to think about how the sleeping habits that most people have of sleeping at night and being awake during the day are actually haven't existed for the whole history of humankind. I can't remember exactly when, but there was a period of time where people used to have like 2 periods of sleep. They'd sleep until like 2 or 3 a.m, then they'd get up and they'd do things and they'd go back to bed at like 5.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's how humankind existed for a while. So this cycle of, we think it's normal to sleep like for 9 hours, 8-9 hours straight, and then wake up and spend the whole day awake, but that's actually not true. It's very interesting.
That's fascinating. Any other like best practices that you found that have really helped your well-being, mental health, and to perform at such a high level?
Other than sleeping.
Yeah.
I think for me the trick that I accidentally discovered whilst revising for my exams was that it's a lot easier to work on things that you enjoy. So, and this probably applies more to the fact that I do geography, was that when I was revising, it's tough enough revising for like, working, I was probably working 7-8 hours a day. Like I'd wake up, I'd revise, and I'd go back to bed.
Wow.
That's because I left revision really late, and then I realised I would be screwed if I didn't really start revising. So
I am taking notes. I
had an intense revision schedule because I realised I'd left it far too late. And if I really regret that, I really wish I started revising earlier because it wouldn't have been nearly as stressful if I had. But working 7 to 8 hours a day is not something that the human brain is meant to do, right?
Really?
Yes, I did. I'm saying these things willy-nilly without citations.
How could Cambridge with so much research?
But this is the thing. I think people the concept here of what a healthy work-life balance is so off kilter. If somebody said to me, "Oh, I woke up at 7 a.m. today and I worked before I went to my lecture," that would be normal to me. I mean, I would never do that, but I would say in my brain,
it's believable.
It's believable.
Sure.
If somebody also said to me, "Oh, I didn't go to bed until 3 a.m. last night because I had an essay due in," that would also be completely believable to me.
Yep.
But that's crazy.
Yep.
That is not how the world outside of Cambridge functions.
Sure.
And here it's so normalised. And every time I catch my brain going, "Oh, it's fine, like it's only 9 p.m, I can just start doing work when I get home," or "Oh, I can wake up early tomorrow morning to finish this piece of work that's due," I have to catch myself and I have to go, that's crazy. Like, that is not the way that the human brain is really meant to function. But going back to the original question about working 7-8 hours a day, I realised somewhere, like, within that revision time, that if I wasn't doing stuff that I enjoyed, I was not going to be able to keep it up. So I ended up, when I was revising, giving myself the space to go into things which I was personally really interested in. And it made time go by a lot quicker. So I'm revising a topic and I've revised the basics of the topic and I've done the reading for kind of the baseline basic essay. But then I need to think about, okay, if I want to get a higher mark, I need to be reading outside of this. I could choose to go down avenues which aren't that interesting to me, which would enrich my essay, but which I wouldn't necessarily enjoy reading about. Or I could choose to go down a route which is really interesting and fascinating to me. And I'm still revising, but it's also not boring me to death. So I would say that's one of the tricks I accidentally stumbled across. And then it helps you develop your own interests, especially for me, that was what made me realise I wanted to keep on studying, because I realised that there were parts of the course which I really gravitated towards, and there were things which I wanted to have more time to read about, which I didn't because I was too busy revising for my first year exams. So yeah, that's the accidental tip that I would have.
It makes sense that if you genuinely enjoy something, then you would go above and beyond, and then the results follow, and you just enjoy that whole process. But throughout your, I guess, academic journey at least, are there also things where deep down are necessary to do well, but you don't enjoy it, but you will grind it out anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that every hardworking person does. You're never gonna be able to enjoy every single aspect of your work, I feel.
So at those moments, what do you think about to power you through?
What I want for myself, I think.
Which is?
I want to keep on studying, and I can't keep on studying if I don't do well. So
why do you want to keep on studying?
Because there are things in my degree which really fascinate me and which I want to know more about. I want to know enough about them to produce more knowledge.
And why is that important?
To me?
Yeah.
Because it gives me a sense of fulfillment, I think.
And why is that important?
Because otherwise I'd be like floating around with no purpose.
And what's wrong with that?
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think I'm the kind of person that needs a goal in order to like live their life.
Why do you think you're the type of person who needs a goal?
Wow, this is going really deep. I think there are people who thrive, who do really well when they don't have any expectations for themselves, or don't have any expectation placed on them, and they enjoy the potential to be able to do whatever they want. Like, for example, people who spend their whole lives travelling. And the whole point of that is that you're not tied down anywhere and you can do whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. I don't think I have the character for that kind of lifestyle. I think I need something which anchors me down and which gives me a sense of purpose and somewhere to go. And I admire the people who don't need that, but I absolutely 100% do. I think because I've probably been raised in that way, to always be thinking about like what am I working towards.
Well, something you are working towards is, if I recall correctly, like a joint master's and PhD, fully funded.
Yeah, well, that's my dream. I'm not going to be presumptuous at all, but the hope is that this time next year I would have funding for both a master's and a PhD, and I wouldn't have to worry about finding money to keep on studying. Yeah.
So you're currently interested in the intersection of feminist theory and urban geographies.
Yeah.
Massive buzzwords, big terms.
Very broad.
Do you want to elaborate?
Well, I've not specified anything just because I don't think I actually know enough yet to really give you an absolutely comprehensive
Are you a
overview.
feminist?
I am a feminist.
How do you define that?
Oh gosh, what a humongous question. You see, if I'd known you were going to ask me this, I would have prepped an essay for you.
I know.
What is feminism? Okay, so I think feminism means different things to different people. To me, it means, and as a person who studies geography, because I think my degree has definitely changed the way that I perceive feminism, because feminist geography is a massive subfield within the discipline. It's about not just the idea that everyone should have equal rights, social, cultural, political rights, which is, I think, the baseline of what most people would say is feminism. I mean, I guess some people would also say that it's about giving women equal rights, but to me, it means everyone. But also, not necessarily just equal rights, but also the acknowledgement of historical and spatial injustices, which mean that even if you gave everyone equal rights today, people wouldn't have the same opportunities because of historical reasons. Structural considerations and intersectionality. And that, to me, is what feminism is. And that is what feminist geography is all about. And it's why I think gravitated towards it so much. I mean, there's a whole other discussion that you could have on feminist methodologies in social sciences. It's a different way of studying people, essentially. But in feminist geography, a lot of the common themes are about acknowledging that different people experience the same things differently because of structural injustices, and about valuing different forms of knowledge and different forms of being equally.
So, do you look much into the policies that are in place, such as like environmental policies? And I'm just thinking, like, when we think about like environmental issues, there's often like a transnational nature, which I think is what you're talking about, where even though these different spaces would experience the impact differently, but something that happens here could very much implicate other areas beyond like a sovereign boundary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Human defined boundary.
I think climate change is another really good example of that, because climate change doesn't believe in borders, right? Climate change completely. I mean, I've literally just written an essay on this, so you've caught me at a good time.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think both the perk and the curse of geography is that you draw from so many disciplines, but you never really go quite into depth. So a lawyer, for example, might be looking at environmental policy in quite a lot of detail, and really learning through the legal implications of different types of environmental policy. Whereas I think with geography, when we study environmental policy, it more serves the purposes of thinking about how people perceive the environment differently in different ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I've literally just written an essay on the COP climate summits, talking about how, for example, something which poses quite a big challenge to this idea you mentioned of the sovereign state and nations is the fact that there are small island states which are disappearing because of rising sea levels. So we're thinking about Pacific island states, and also around the area of the Caribbean. There are small islands there which A, have a colonial history, so that's really important, have had a history of colonial exploitation and environmental exploitation, and B, whose physical lands will be disappearing. And one of the anchoring pillars of this idea of the nation state is that the nation state is bound to its physical territory, right? So a state is defined by its control over a given territory. This territory exists and is bounded in a specific way. And the legal system, for example, uses these conceptions of what the nation state is, right? So the international legal system is formulated around this idea of the nation. What happens when a state loses its land and doesn't have that key link anymore and wants to make a claim to justice? How can the legal order adjust to that or account for that? And that's a really interesting question, which is something that we're learning about right now, actually. And it's not something I have the answer to, by the way, before you ask. It's not something I have the answer to.
I guess what I find, and again, I'm not the most educated in this area, there's still a lot more reading I need to do. But what I find really interesting is that there is a widespread acceptance that environmental issue has a transnational nature.
Yeah.
And for that reason, there has been more of a tendency for policies in this space to be like universalizing. Like when you mentioned COP, but also when you think about the UN, their kind of sustainable development goals, millennial development goals, or education for sustainable development, ESD, it's all about this idea of, because this is a global problem, so we need a global solution, which sounds very reasonable and sounds very like we're addressing it at the scale that is needed. But I guess what I personally think at this point in time, at least, is that by having these kind of broadcasted policies by the UN, it forgets, A, the local context and the dynamics that are in place. Like rural India, it would be very different to the UK, it would be very different to Switzerland, would be very different in China. But it also, again, as you highlighted earlier, that it neglects the structural and historical concerns, such as with colonialism, that even if you treat everybody equally now, you're actually not treating everyone equally because there hasn't been equal. And I was just wondering...
Well, again, you sound like a critical geographer, David.
Do I?
Yeah, absolutely. That is an argument that a critical geographer would make.
So I guess, I don't expect you to have a fully fleshed out answer. I don't think anyone in the world currently do, but what are some of the solutions that you would be inclined to research more about in this space?
If I were queen of the world?
Yeah. There we go. You just helped me with my question.
Oh God, that's such a massive question. And if I pause to think about it, it's going to be really boring for the listeners because I'd be silent for 5 minutes just thinking things through. I definitely think one of the things that I would be pro is empowering local people in their local contexts. And that would address the issue that you mentioned of the fact that things like global goals and global governance really obfuscate localized processes. And also within the idea of global governance, you'd have structures of power regardless. So if you're looking at something like COP, there are structures of geopolitical power within these summits. So one common thread that you see a lot within feminist scholarship is the idea that you should be asking the people who are affected by this, what they want. And to avoid seeing them as a homogenous mass, to avoid seeing them as victims, to avoid disempowering them. So that's one thing that I would put forward, is really paying attention to localized context and doing everything possible to give those people agency over not only the policies that impact them, but also the narratives that are being created around them. So that's such a massive question. I'll actually have to think about that now. It's not something that I can answer off the top of my head.
Of course, yeah. And I guess the point of this isn't to necessarily for you to have a perfectly crafted answer. It's more to just test out your thinking process.
Yeah.
And I hope when you look back in 10, 20 years' time, when you're actually the queen of the world...
I'll just think, oh my god, she was so stupid. She was so stupid. Yeah, I'm not an environmental governance. I mean, there are people in my year group who I know are very interested in this kind of thing. But that's I'm not an environmental governance girl.
But it sounds like you're very much like a champion for justice and for equality, and I was just wondering, like, you've mentioned a bit about that kind of immigrant kind of mentality that you've seen, the sacrifice from your parents, but why social justice, and why does it excite you so much, and why does it mean so much to you?
Again, that's a big question.
Always big
questions. Yeah, well, I think there's two parts to this. The first is that I definitely think my degree has definitely radicalised me a little bit. So not radicalised me in the sense of, like, I'm going to be tearing down the government, but I more mean that it's
Extinction Rebellion.
It's really exposed me to new ways of thinking, which I hadn't considered before coming here, and it's not only about social justice to me is not only it's not just about championing causes of social justice, which I absolutely think is important, and also I think I can't champion all types of social justice because I'm not really entitled to do that, like I'm situated in a very specific position in my identity as a woman, as a Chinese person, as a middle class person. So there are only so many causes where I can genuinely claim to have a voice. But that social justice is such an interesting way of thinking through the issues that I am confronted with in my degree. And when I use these frameworks of social justice, they really help me understand these because when you're studying geography, you're studying massive issues. Like, for example, we just spent 10 minutes speaking about climate change, which is such a border traversing issue. But you're also looking at things like capitalism. You're looking at things like colonialism, and they're humongous issues. And so for me, the social justice lens is a really useful and not simple. This is not simple. I don't know why I just said the word simple. It's a really useful and eye-opening way of looking at those issues. But also, the second part of it is, like I said, within my own identity, as a woman of colour growing up in a society which is white, I obviously I acknowledge that I occupy a position of immense privilege in my financial position, in the schools that I went to, the fact that I can speak English, like, there are so many ways in which I am incredibly privileged.
You're so good at music.
And I'm amazing at the saxophone. Yeah. That's the main privilege. But that in those parts of my identity, that's where social justice really speaks to me.
I guess a couple of things. First things first, you mentioned that your degree has given you new ways of thinking.
Yeah.
So in the 1.5 years that you started at Cambridge, is there a big issue or a particular matter where you have changed your mind on something that you previously a deeply held belief that you've now evolved?
That's interesting. No, I actually don't think so. I think there were things which I didn't really have fully formed opinions on, and I didn't think I knew enough to have an opinion on them. And then I came here and I was taught about them properly, or not properly. I was taught about. I don't think you can ever know everything about anything, right? But I was taught more about them, and I did my own reading, and I ended up forming stronger opinions on them. I don't think I changed my mind massively. Geography is a very left-wing leaning subject, 100%. But I was already left-wing leaning before I came here. Okay. So it didn't really rock my world necessarily, but I think it definitely gave me a more well-rounded, well-informed way of thinking about things. Although, of course, there are people who would completely disagree with my opinions. And that's not to say that they're not well-informed either.
Yeah, I mean, they can disagree, but there's only one Tripos topper. So. I guess something that it reminded me when you talked about, like, you kind of describing your identity, on that walk we had back from Emma Jazz rehearsal, we grabbed KFC, then we walked back to
night.
your... Yeah, it was a really good night. And you were talking about, like, at Westminster...
Yes.
Because boys were already there and then girls had to enter. Mm-hmm. And there was that one incident that you talked about where you, I think, confronted. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that in the context of, like, your identity and your continual kind of assessment of who you are in the context of society.
Just society or Westminster? Because they're two very different things. Yeah,
a lot of them seem to think they're the same.
Well, when you're here, it feels like it's just an extension of school sometimes. Yeah, my time at Westminster was really bizarre for me because I was occupying a space that was not made for me. In the sense that Westminster, I mean, when I was there, Westminster went through a lot of turmoil in the sense of, I was there in June 2020, when the BLM protests started really gaining traction in the UK, and after the murder of George Floyd, and that period of time was, within the school, I think, a reckoning with the systemic issues of racism within the school, which is because, I mean... I'm not going to assume that everybody listening knows what Westminster is. It's a public school, and it has a very long tradition of being an institution which was built by rich white men, and girls only come in at 16, and so there are a lot of... I'm explaining this for people who are listening. There are a lot of cultural issues surrounding the school, I think. And then I want to say it was... sort of December 2020 into 2021, that was when the Everybody's Invited stuff happened. I don't know if you know what that was. So it was this social media account which blew up, which was posting stories, anonymous stories, from schools around the UK, from people detailing their experiences with sexual harassment. And it really exposed the underbelly of some of these very well-known, very prestigious schools in England, about the behaviour of some of the students, and sparked this sort of movement which aimed to expose what was going on. And Westminster was one of the schools that was on the top of that list.
Wow.
So there were loads of stories anonymised stories from people saying, this boy who I knew who was from Westminster did this to me. Wow. And there were so many. And it actually ended up in I want to say it was the Telegraph, ended up in the Telegraph. And I was there for both of these big sort of massive disruptions to the school culture. And there were 2 reports that came out, one on racism within the school and one on sexism within the school. And the school had hired someone to kind of investigate these internal goings on. So I was there as a woman of colour in these 2 moments, right? And... there was also a sense that I had not come from the same financial background as a lot of the people that I went to school with. Interestingly enough, money was not talked about that often, but it was very obvious in people's behaviour. And that's not at all to say that, people were treated differently because, they didn't come from a rich background. And there were people who were there on financial bursaries. There were people who were there on scholarships, and there was financial diversity within the year group. But by and large, because Westminster is a public school, the people that were there were well off. They were people who lived in expensive areas, who could afford to send their children to this school. And I had come from a position where my parents did pay money for me to go there. That's one thing which I want to be transparent about. They absolutely did pay money for me to go there. And I'm so incredibly lucky and privileged to have been in that position. I think the difference was that knowledge for me, that my parents had paid for me to be there, that money was quite a lot of money for us. It was it was a big investment for them. It wasn't like a drop in the well. It was a big investment for them. Whereas I know that for other people, going to school and paying that money, they didn't even think about it. And that's not, I'm not holding anything against them for that, but that I was going through my time in the school as a woman of colour in this very white male institution, also with the knowledge of the financial burden that my parents had undertaken for me to be there. And so it felt almost simultaneously that I was entering this new world of people who lived a completely different lifestyle to what I'd been used to, and who moved in different circles to me. Because I think a lot of the wealth in England is generational wealth, right? It's old money, it's old wealth. It's people who are coming from families who have held wealth for a long time. And obviously new money does exist in England, but the class system in England is still quite, I would argue, pronounced. Partially because of the education system. And this must be interesting for you to hear coming from a place which I doesn't have the history that the UK does. And oh god, I've lost my train of thought now. So moving into these new circles and entering almost, it was like a different world. I come from this grammar school in northwest London where everybody was Asian, and it was technically an all girls school, so it was almost like a complete 180, and suddenly I was thrown into this world of people who had gone to private school all their lives and who lived in central London, and they were lovely people. I mean, I'm not at all saying that they weren't. But it was a big culture shock for me, I think. And those 2 years, going back to your question that you asked me a really, really long time ago about how it changed the way that I saw myself and my identity. I think actually those 2 years in a space where I did integrate, but I also never fully felt like I fit in. It ended up giving me a much stronger sense of self. I came out of those 2 years feeling much more certain in who I was, oxymoronically, by virtue of having inhabited a space where I didn't feel I belonged. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I absolutely loved my time there. I owe so much to my time there. I owe so much to the school, and I owe so much to my parents for being able to send me there. And I learned an immense amount about myself. But that was through kind of the culture shock and living in a different world for 2 years.
So on a day-to-day level at Westminster, when you were there going through that turmoil concerning racism and sexism, what was it like? What were you feeling?
Well, it was also during COVID.
And COVID.
So yeah, my 2 years there were really quite chaotic, I think, because of all the external factors. When you say how I felt, what do you mean? As in, how did I personally...
Yeah, like day to day, were you always thinking about these kind of identity issues and how you belonged relative to others? Were you perhaps lonely? Were you hopeful? Like, what?
I had a really good group of friends, and I still keep in touch with them to this day. And I had a really, really good group of friends who made my 2 years there. I think without them, I would have had an awful time, essentially. I think it felt to me as if the culture was shifting a little. I'm not sure whether...
For the better?
It's really difficult to judge because culture shift doesn't happen in a year, right? It takes a really long time. I noticed that people were being more careful with what they said. And I noticed that the school was perhaps being more receptive to certain voices. But it's really hard just as a singular student to grasp or to fully understand because the culture change requires change in the staff and in the institution's priorities. And that's not something which I was privy to as a student. But I definitely noticed in my peers, I think, that there were people who really realised a lot of things during those 2 years. I think those were 2 big years for the school when I was there.
So your parents made this decision and this big investment to send you there. So now that you have actually gone through that process, and I don't know if you want to be a mother, say if you are in a similar situation as your parents, where you could send your kids to a school like Westminster, but it would obviously be a tremendous sacrifice. Do you think it's worth that sacrifice for a kid to go through that?
That's a question of firstly, you're asking me if I believe in private schools, right? Because, I mean, I don't really think I have a valid opinion on this issue because I benefited from going to a private school. So for me to then turn around and say, I don't think private schools should exist, it's kind of like, well, you're benefiting from it. So, but that's a question. A, do I believe in private schools? And B, if I did, would I send my kid there? And C, if I did and I sent my kid there, would I send my kid to Westminster, right? So there are...
And it's like, how much are you willing to give for that?
Yeah.
It's a loaded question.
The education at Westminster is unique. I mean, I'm saying this as someone who... I mean, I've obviously never been to any other school, but I really do think that there is something about the fact that it's in central London, that it has an international population. Not just it has an international population, and that it seems to continue doing so well in terms of sending kids to Oxbridge and exam results. And my time there was really, now looking back, it was almost like a mini Oxbridge, my experience at sixth form. It was guided teaching, but the intellectual independence which I gained during my time there is not something I'm sure I would have gained at another school. There was almost, funnily enough, for a school which seems to do well, there was no focus on exams whatsoever. Genuinely, I did not know what my A-levels would look like. I didn't know what the exams would be. Because there was no... I remember this so vividly. I'd come from a school where the emphasis was very much on exam results. And I loved my time there. I really enjoyed my time there. But it would be like, we'd come into the lesson and the teacher would go, okay, so for your exam, this is what you need to know. And I did very well in my exams. Everybody did really well in their exams. And I moved to this school where I thought the same thing would be happening because the results were also very good. But I remember so vividly that in my first term at the school, when I was really wanted to prove myself, wanted to, prove that I belonged in this environment, this new environment. And I did French A-level, so we were doing a play in French. And I remember I really struggled with it because it was a play and I'd never done anything beyond GCSE. And we spent about 2 or 3 weeks on it. And it was I can't remember which play it was, but I think it was Molière, actually. And then after the 3 weeks, and I spent these 3 weeks like really focusing on the play, struggling, thinking, oh my God, I need to know this because it's going to be in my exam at the end of year 13. And the teacher turned and he went, okay, we're done with the play. By the way, that's not relevant to the exam. We're not going to be doing it. It's not even on the syllabus. I just wanted to show it to you guys because I thought it was really interesting.
Wow.
And I just went, what? What do you mean? There's no focus on exams here. And there really wasn't. It was mentioned in passing, but it was never the...
And you think that's precisely why students end up doing so well, because they are taught to be intrinsically motivated and to articulate their views?
Yeah, I also think that Westminster teaches people to... And I'm saying this, I think other public schools also do, other private schools also do this. There's a culture of intellectual debate at Westminster, which I think has ended up getting people into... is a slippery slope, because everything was up for debate. You were taught that your opinions had weight and that you had the right to voice yourself. And you would sit in these very small... my class was probably 6 or 7 people. You'd sit in these very small classes and you'd just debate things. And, sometimes you'd be debating things which maybe people didn't necessarily need to be debating. Things about human rights or things about, which, for example, a really good example was when BLM happened in June 2020. And in one of my classes, one of the people said that he personally did not think that Winston Churchill had done anything wrong. And obviously, I'm not gonna state my opinion on that. But obviously, that is Winston Churchill was a very contentious historical figure. But there were people in that room who were made very uncomfortable by his conjectures. But because there was this culture of, everything is just a debate, there are no consequences to it, everything is just an exercise in intellect, people were taught to voice their opinions in articulate manners and to really believe that they had the right to speak, basically. And that really stands you in quite good stead, I think. For example, in an Oxbridge interview, where you're asked to give your opinion on something, or you're asked to think through quite complex issues on the spot. And that was common. That was really common. That was very day-to-day at school for me. I think it's people when parents pay to send their kids to Westminster, they're not just paying for the education, they're paying for the culture. They're paying for their child to learn about how that culture works, to be able to move in that way, and
social capital.
To conduct it's social capital, social and cultural capital, 100%. And I was immensely privileged to have been given that opportunity. But I also think it's symbolic of a much wider issue in British society that was necessary.
So, in terms of education in a vacuum, then, would you then want every school to have that kind of intellectually stimulating and open environment?
I'm trying to think of a way to say this in a way which makes sense. I think, so if we're going back to the idea of cultural capital, right? So are you asking me if all schools should have this environment of cultural capital? Well, things are only made cultural in contradistinction to other things. Culture can only exist because you're defining what culture is, and therefore implicitly what culture isn't, right? So, like, what makes a specific work of art more cultural than another work of art? Like, why is it more valid? Why is, not to knock on Shakespeare or anything, because his, obviously, he was a genius. But why are, for example, Shakespeare's work valued as, like, a higher form of intellect than, for example, I don't know, a romance novel, Like, what? It's because that these things are pitted against in comparison to each other. And that itself is bound up in ideas of what is superior and what is not. Like, what forms of knowledge are seen to be more valid. So I think that's a really, if you were to give every school this access to cultural capital, that would completely take away the advantages of going to these schools, right? The point of going to these schools and why parents want to send their kids to these schools is because it gives you that advantage. But if everybody was cultured, there'd be no such thing as uncultured, and then you wouldn't be able to
have cultured,
and you wouldn't be able to kind of position yourself in a superior position to everyone else, right?
We also talked about, on our walk, about that UK London private school vibe. So you kind of mentioned how by meeting someone almost, just through a conversation, you're almost able to tell whether they went to a private school, whether they went to one of those London private schools. Can you summarise maybe the top 2 or 3 features that enable you to just go, he or she or they went to a UK private school, London private school?
I really don't think there are any.
Ooh.
Because it can be, people are really diverse. People who go, apart from financial backgrounds, it's a real range of
But you
characters.
also mentioned how, some people really try and have those features so that they can be perceived in that way for social prestige reasons, right? And what are those features then? What do people try and pretend to be? Or what are the stereotypes?
Yeah, what are the stereotypes? You're a member of the union, aren't you? I'm sure.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, when you think about it, I would say probably one thing is the accent.
Okay, the Australian accent?
Well, yes, absolutely. There's a certain way that people carry themselves, I think. See, this whole conversation that we've had risks generalising people massively.
Of course.
And there's no one archetype or one stereotype. I really don't want to generalise people. I don't want to come off as if I think I'm above it all, because I'm literally part of the culture, so I can't really
What
judge
isn't
it.
generalising, though, is your personal rock collection. What does that mean? Oh, the rocks, I'm sure, are very different. Tell me about the uniqueness of your rocks.
Yeah, I'm a geographer. In case people hadn't figured out by now. And I am a human geographer. I'm much more interested in human geography, but I do like to dabble in a bit of physical geography every now and then. And when I was around 14 or 15, I started collecting rocks. Literally just rocks. Like, when I say rock collection, it does what it says on the tin. It's a collection of rocks. I would pick up rocks which I thought were cool and that looked pretty, and I put them in a box. And then it got to the point, it turned into a whole thing where my friends would go on holiday and they'd bring me back rocks. So I've rocks from all over the world. I've rocks from Greece, I've rocks from parts of the UK, I've rocks from India, I've rocks from China, I've rocks from everywhere. Anywhere that my friends have gone on holiday, they'll bring me back a rock. And it's just nice to have like little parts from all over the world.
Wait, so when you see a rock, you associate it with that memory of that
Yeah,
person?
yeah, absolutely.
You know exactly which rock is whose.
Well, yeah, because they all look different, because I only...
But how many rocks do you have in that collection?
Oh my god, probably about 20?
Okay, and if I just pull a random one out, you would be able to tell me a
Yeah,
story
probably.
based on it?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
I
used to carry them. My favourite ones, I used to carry them in my bag for luck.
Is that why your bag is so heavy?
It's why it like jangles every time I lift it. Yeah.
Wow, I mean, rocks. You got about 20.
Yeah, I would say, probably about 20.
But there are billions of rocks around the world. What enables a rock to be able to be added
Such a philosophical
to
question.
your collection?
If
I just give you a rock now, would
Yeah.
that just be added to your collection?
Yeah, probably.
As the 21st?
Yeah, well, so the rocks that I pick up, I'll pick them up if I think they look cool. So if there's like something that's physically standing out about them. So if there's a cool pattern or they're a really weird shape, I'll pick it up. The rocks that I get from other people are chosen by them, not by me.
Okay.
It's that person that's chosen the rock. And the rock is special because it's from another part of the world and because it's a person that somebody else has chosen it for me.
So are you quite like what's the word, like spiritual in the sense that you feel like these are kind of made for you, these rocks, they've been chosen for you, so therefore there's
maybe not necessarily spiritual, but
connection.
I'm a very sentimental person.
Sentimental,
yeah. I mean, I have rocks in my collection from people that I don't speak to anymore.
But the rock is...
But the rock is still there. The rock is immortal. Yeah, I think it's the person that's attached to that rock. But also, like, it's cool to think that I'm holding something in my hand which is from a complete different part of the world. Sometimes parts of the world that I've never visited.
If you wake up tomorrow morning and realise that half of your rock collection have been stolen,
Yeah.
what would be your gut instinct reaction?
I'd burst into tears. And I wouldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks.
I don't think you were joking.
Yeah, I would be really sad. I'd be really sad. My rock collection is I mean, I take it, it's in Cambridge with me. I take it wherever I go. Like, I take it back home and I take it to Cambridge when I come back here. I've had it since I was 14, so...
Wow.
Yeah. It's going on,
I'd love to
6 years
see
now?
some of those rocks, maybe at the next Immigrants.
I'm going to have to carry all my 20 rocks. They're quite heavy, because there's 20 of them.
Obviously, I know you through Emma Jazz.
Uh-huh.
You're exceptional at the saxophone, and I mean that wholeheartedly. I think the solos that you do and everything. We just have a great band, and it's always great to hear you play. And I think your sense of humour as well really, really stands out, and I'm sure listeners can hear that for themselves. But you just always seems to have something funny to say, and I was wondering, like, do you feel like music has kind of shaped a lot of your personality? Because with like soloing, for example, and improvisation, there is that boldness to innovate and to be creative and to have your own flair, and you're very much, and as I said earlier in the introduction, like, you're quite a quirky person in a good way.
Yeah, so I started playing music in the same way that I think a lot of Asian immigrants do, which is when my parents said, do you want to play the violin or the piano, because you've got to choose one. And playing classical music is good for you. And I started playing piano when I was about 5 or 6. Then I continued it all the way up. I mean, I still play nowadays. I mean, I don't have lessons anymore, but I still play it every now and then. And then I picked up saxophone when I was 11. And I really took to it. I had been learning classical music for so long, and then suddenly, I did classical grades on saxophone as well, so I was classically trained in the saxophone, but I picked up jazz by accident because my music teacher said that they needed a saxophone in the band. and it was just so much more exciting to me than, I mean, not at all to look down on people who play classical music, because they have a level of skill which I can only aspire to, but like jazz and funk and blues really, I think, spoke to me a lot more than classical music ever did. And music has been, I have played music constantly since I was consistently in various forms since I was 6. I've never stopped. Has always been, because I don't take it that seriously. It's like there are people who really, really invest time into it, and absolutely respect to them. But to me, it's always been something which I do to relax myself, and I do it on a casual basis. I don't put pressure on myself. Emma Jazz is so fun. It's so fun. Half the fun is the people. It's not the jazz. David. It's not the jazz. It's the people.
It's all me.
Yeah,
when I'm not at basketball.
Yeah, exactly. It's basketball or Emma Jazz or the podcast. That's it. Those are your three areas of life. So I would say it's really been a comfort to me. I haven't in that because I've never taken it really seriously and really intensely, and I've been playing jazz since I was 12 or 13, and I still like to play it once or twice a week now, and I don't take it seriously, and I don't, I know I'm not the best jazz musician out there, obviously, but it's a really, really good break to my week, and yeah, it keeps me sane. It definitely keeps me sane. I think I would probably go crazy if I didn't have it. Yeah.
Well, Josephine, this podcast is about giving you a legacy-worthy interview, which I consider like a meaningful piece of recording that captures a snapshot of who you currently are and that you can look back on in 10, 20 years' time with great meaning and fulfillment. Is there anything else that you feel like is very important to you that you might want to be featured in this recording?
Is this like a message to my future self?
Or? It could be. Or else I've got a couple final questions as well, but is there anything else that you want to be included?
Oh, God. This is so much pressure. I feel like I'm going to listen to this in 20 years, and if I don't have anything to say to myself now... You know what? No, I think you've done a pretty good job. I think I would tell myself, hopefully if she's still there, to just keep on going.
Will you outlast your rock?
Will I outlast my rocks? No. No, rocks are immortal. Well, they'll probably get eroded in time, but I'm not going to outlast my rocks, no.
Second to last question then.
Yeah.
When you think about the person you are, the things that you've been through, the memories that you've had, the ups and downs, who have been your rocks, and and could you maybe share some words of gratitude so that if they ever listen to this, they could feel that love and appreciation? Oh my god, this is so much pressure. I feel like I'm going to forget someone and they're going to be really upset with me and they're going to say, why didn't you mention me in your podcast? But there's only 20 rocks.
So I think obviously the first people would be my parents, who everybody has this difficult relationships with their parents. There's always going to be difficulties in that relationship, but I owe so much of myself to them. I owe so much of my achievements to them. And they've instilled me with a work ethic and a sense of purpose, and I owe them so much. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. Not like literally biologically speaking, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them, but also in terms of everything else, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to repay a gift which cannot be repaid. Like, the things they have given me are so beyond measure. So those are my first two rocks. Oh my god, I really don't want to make people think that like I'm like prioritizing them or that I'm forgetting. Well, I'm not going to name names just in case they don't want to be named, but I have very good friends, and I've had them. Some of them I've had since I was in secondary school, and some of them I only met at Westminster, and some of them I've met here at Cambridge, who have seen me through everything, have seen me through heartbreaks and neuroticisms and breakdowns, and have really been my actual rocks and have given me actual rocks. And yeah, I think the age I am now, I'm 19 at the moment. People go through so much change and growth in these years. Being a teenager is hard. It sucks. And you know, I think I would have really struggled if it weren't for my friends. So if they're listening, definitely my friends are my rocks. And then the biggest rock of all, though, I think, is I'm a big believer in the concept that, like, the only person that you know is always going to be there is you. Like, you have to show up for yourself because you're the only person you can always rely on. And no, you're not saying that all that, you know, friends always leave because they don't, but like, and that, you know, people aren't reliable because they are. But that one of the things which I think is a journey in progress for a lot of people and for me as well, is the idea of always trying to show up for yourself and always trusting in yourself and being able to rely on yourself and being okay with that. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely.
To have a lot of gratitude for the people around you, but also to have faith that you're able to handle things in your own way, in your own time. Yeah.
Final question then, your final chance to share your message on the podcast. What's one message, quote, or saying you wish every educator, parent, teacher, community leader would promote and every kid would internalise?
Why are you asking me these big questions without any preparation? Community leaders.
Just any role model, you get the point. Too many terms to define.
Yeah, there's too many. There's things that I want, you know, all of the people in my life to know. There's no such thing as wasted effort, in my opinion. You can put a lot of effort into people, into relationships, and they don't necessarily always work out, and they don't necessarily always pan out the way you wanted them to, and you may think, you know, that was a waste of my time and a waste of my effort. And that may be true in one sense, but also there's no such thing as like effort that's not gone anywhere, because even if it's not manifested in the way that you wanted it to, it's still a way for you to learn something about yourself and to learn something about the world around you.
Very, very wise words, Jerry, and I just want to thank you again for your sense of humour, for your honesty, and for the intellectually kind of stimulating content that you always provide us in every conversation. And I've really enjoyed sharing the Emma Jazz experience with you, and I think you've inspired me a lot in terms of bringing that energy and bubbliness into every interaction. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, David.